True for that. I'm on the laptop.
And if you don't have the business slides.
Yes. I think so. As usual, we are a little behind. If you come from PowerPoint, that actually mostly works. So. Go ahead. I will upload this stuff again later on.
You've been on the phone a bunch, and you're going to come into the corner too.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I remember you from Chicago. I think you were in this breakout.
Yes, probably anything has to do there. So I'm excited about to hear what the report is.
Yeah.
I've been kind of agitating about it.
Okay.
At least about a year and a half to 2 years in the IETF. There's this phenomenon going on. What are we doing? What can we do?
Yeah, sounds great.
Yeah, it's nice to meet you. I've seen you, but and then, just when you were holding that session, I was really sorry not to be here on Friday.
No worries. So, I mean, I myself went in there to actually ask, okay, what's actually the status, what's going on, because kind of my responsibility shifted into this direction. So I'm partly taking over what Dirk also has
Well, then
been
we
doing.
really should talk. That would be great.
Yeah,
I'd
so
like to hear more.
yeah, so I had some ideas on that we maybe there is this wrap which is actually quite good from entry, the Hong and Hong.
Oh, okay.
that starts with the problem statement, gives some background on
And
this
is
is
it
what we
in thing
have.
to thing or is it ICM?
It's in thing to thing. The problem is they didn't submit it specifically to thing to thing.
So it's kind of floating.
Yeah, exactly. But so when they submitted the first version, it was kind of where this work should happen. But they said this was interesting, and there has been some positive feedback from some Ericsson guys, for instance, in particular for the industrial use case of IoT
So
edge computing.
did you look at all the other stuff that's been included?
Yes, so
Okay,
get overview. So you had this gap analysis of
Yeah,
the
but
circuits
that's
on. However, it
Is
was
this
kind
like
of a document. It was more the slides. So
You have to
maybe
do
you can then actually help
we
me.
can get you the document.
Yeah.
And, also, so like it's presented today.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it was a thing to thing, or maybe it was a
Is this like
I
on
can't
the-
remember. It was I think it was presented here, and then there was a beyond edge computing one.
Yeah, that I also saw there was no activity, but so I heard about this activity. So since I'm with Huawei now, people pointed me to this. I looked into this and I asked Mike McBride.
Yes, but what's interesting is that I attended his session, and as a result, told him that I thought that the problem of edge data discovery, edge data management,
I saw
is
this
important.
document.
So
Yeah.
so I did like a serious class on it in the second version, so version 01. So I feel like those are some kinds of problems that could be edge related, and it isn't attached to a working group either. Just because I'm now part of the point of
Okay. Yeah.
stuff, we'll present it there, but it can easily be presented too,
Yeah.
part of the edge. Anyway, they're all
Yeah, that's what
They
I'm
all
trying to
overlap.
figure out, like
Exactly.
how to.
And Quinnergy is a spin-off of this. So,
Okay. No, you see it like this. Is it?
well, I think that's what happened. Last time it was a breakout session from into the working group.
Yeah, but it was really organized as coin group. We then actually hijacked it from the thing to thing group because
Really?
they also use edge computing related, so we should listen to what they are doing. That's kind of that's how I learned about this connectivity. So it was a good thing.
But yeah, it would be great to hear what you do with the network first. Is that, or is it getting some other names?
So what I was hinting at was that you have kind of this thing-centric view. So you're a small device, and then you look for some service, which could be some compute node, maybe a storage possibility for you as a constraint node. So this approach, opposed to if we have network infrastructure and we can facilitate more. So this is actually something I also want to understand, and which was also discussed on the mailing list. Like, where does it go? Is it really now we have application logic and switches, or
Yes, it's a big conundrum. You know, how much are they the same and how much are they different? And depending on where you live in that spectrum of data center to somewhat closer to the device, what should that network element do? And if it facilitates compute, what kind of compute? Is it switching compute? Is it routing compute? Is it AI? Is it encryption? You know, so so we're trying to decompose those and at least be systematic.
yeah, overdue already? So
Yeah, okay. I guess when they say we're going to start.
I don't think it's us.
But so some of that will come out of it.
I mean, I only asked for 5 minutes, so don't expect too much on the first day, but it's
You'll put
Okay,
up
better broken than the
right?
other.
on a
Better broken
different
than
thing,
the
but
other.
of course it's also somehow related. It's this Web of Things work we do in W3C, which we are about to wrap up for the first iteration, so making the first standards available. That's maybe the better phrasing.
Yeah, no, so Michael McCool
Yeah,
is someone who I interact with a lot. So I
Okay, yeah, and he's
and then
my
the wishes
co-chair.
stuff. Anyway, so we clearly have to talk more.
Why is everything I'm trying broken? Okay, go ahead. Almost there.
Okay, welcome everyone to Thinking Research Group meeting, and sorry for the delay. There's a bunch of technical problems apparently with the network, so shouldn't be expecting to download files larger than 1 megabyte over the network today. So as usual, we are at the IETF, the IRTF meetings. Note well applies. You are being recorded, and the usual IPR guidelines do apply. We will be sending ping sheets shortly once we get them signed up. We'd like to get a volunteer extra note taker. So if someone can, I'll be also taking notes on the Etherpad, so you don't have to do it alone. But I'll be also doing some talking, so it would be good for someone to help on the Etherpad. The Etherpad link is on the GitHub repo, so you'll find it from there. Okay, excellent. Thanks, George. The agenda for today, we will give you a very brief intro and RG status in the beginning, and then we will give a report from some of the recent activities in the WISHI, in the pre-work meeting we had on Friday, and also from the hackathon. Then we have Michael Koster joining remotely to present the W3C community group schema extensions. Matthias will give an update on the Web of Things group. And then Klaus will give us a presentation, and we have some time for discussion on using Coral to bring more hypermedia to IoT. And finally, Christian Amsus will be presenting research directory replication. Any questions or comments on the agenda? Okay, so we have a Coral site meeting upcoming. It's on Wednesday, 3 to 5 p.m. in room Tirolka. Klaus will be driving that. The usual, what are we doing in the research group? What is our scope and goals? We are looking into these open research issues, how we can really turn the IoT that we are working on into reality. We are focusing here on things that there is opportunities for IETF standardization. You're basically starting with the IP layer, going all the way up to the application layer and APIs. Often we get a question, so what is the relationship between the IRTF Thinking Research Group and all the IETF IoT work? So, of course, there is a lot of overlap on the topics where we are looking into, in particular with CORE and LWIC working groups. So as you know, LWIC is giving this informational guidance for implementers, how you can actually implement IoT on the constraint space. And in CORE, we are doing a lot of protocol engineering for the RESTful environments. So Thinking RG is mainly looking on those things that are still falling outside of the scope of these groups and the other IoT-related groups. And looking how we can be extending the areas where we can make an impact, but then doing also work together with these research groups, these working groups. And occasionally we are handing off work from the research group, the working groups, but on the other hand, sometimes we discover group work in the working groups, which falls outside of their area today and can be, for example, discussed here. Some recent activities where we have been involved, we've been driving this work on IoT semantic hypermedia interoperability called WISHI. That was started 2 years ago here in Prague in the original WISHI workshop, and then we have had a lot of virtual meetings and a bunch of hackathons. Actually had the 5th hackathon this time here at this IETF. Also, we had a WebEx session with the OMA SpecWorks, similar to sessions we have had with OCF earlier on, about aligning the use of IETF technologies and with OMA SpecWorks technology, in particular lightweight M2M protocol and the IPSO models. Also, we had a work meeting this Friday before the IETF week here in Prague. Next meetings, we are planning to continue the WISHI calls, most likely someday around May. Usually be monthly or bi-weekly basis. There is still work to be done together with OCF, so we'd like to have more virtual meetings with them. Likewise with OMA SpecWorks, with whom we had the first meeting sometime before this IETF. There is going to be a W3C Web of Things workshop happening in June. Matthias will tell a bit more about that. But there's also likely good collaboration with the things in RG and other organizations. And then, of course, at the next IETF in Montreal, we're planning to have yet again a Wishy hackathon on the weekend before. And there's also potential to have a joint meeting with the OMA SpecWorks. So OMA is meeting the week before in Montreal. So potentially on the Friday, we could have a face-to-face activity together with OMA. Also, we have had this long-standing desire to have more academic involvement in the group. So we are looking for potential co-location academic conferences during this year. If you have any good ideas on that, please do approach us chairs. We're more than happy to discuss with you. The document status. The state-of-the-art challenges for the IoT security is currently in the RFC editor queue. So that will be the first RFC we'll publish any day now. It's actually on the top of the queue. So we expect that to be ready very soon. We also have another research group document, RESTful Design for IoT. I will have a bit more details in the upcoming slides on that. And we have also a bunch of documents we've been discussing, in particular on the Friday meeting, that we could be taking on as a research group topics. There has been quite a lot of work done on the Edge and IoT, so having a research group document on that could make a lot of sense. On core applications and on the whole Coral ecosystem, if you wish, some part of that work would make a lot of sense to do here in the RG. Some of that has to be done in the working group where it's standardization work, but then the more explorative parts, for example, application descriptions, are very much related to this RESTful design for IoT work that we have here. So we've been discussing about having a group of documents around that space. And for example, one part from the core interfaces draft that has been in the core working group could become actually an RG document giving guidance how you work on this environment. Also, there's a bunch of other documents where you can have a look at the Friday meeting notes for more details. One topic we discussed then was this layer 3 considerations. I have another more detailed slide then on upcoming. We could make some document out of that. And in the Wishy work, we have been making a set of what we call Wishy notes. Right now, a set of informal wiki pages, but turning some of those potentially into RG documents longer term would be the right way to go. So for RESTful design, the next steps that we are planning for the RESTful design draft is adding new terminology. I have next slide on more details. But then also, we've been discussing, it would be great to get some more practical experience for building IoT systems involved there. So if you are involved in building a IoT system and you have some experience you'd like to share, we'd be more than happy to talk with you and get some of that guidance in part of the document. How can you in practice build RESTful-based IoT systems? Also, we're planning to get more reviews also outside of this group, but of course, all the reviews in this group are more than welcome. And we have perhaps now a ambitious goal for getting ready for publication rather soon, perhaps even next IETF. So I mentioned about some additions to the terminology. We are planning for 2 new terms there, a transfer protocol and transfer layer. And actually, these are not really any new terms. We've been using these in the core working of thinking research group probably up to a decade already now. But it turns out we never formally defined what do we mean by a transfer protocol or transfer layer. Some examples that we'll be referring to these protocols is especially CoAP and all versions of HTTP, so our RESTful suite of protocols. But also other protocols that you could use in an IoT system, like AMQP, MQTT, XMPP, for example. They all have kind of these similar characteristics that you could describe as a transfer protocol. So we have now drafted 2 early draft definitions. I would very much like your input and feedback on these. You can read them on the slides, but they basically, for transfer protocols, And here we're now discussing in particular IoT domain because the draft is about RESTful IoT. But the transport protocols would be protocols about transport layer that are used to transfer data objects and provide semantics for operations on the data. The key thing is that you are transferring some sort of data objects between systems, and you provide some additional semantics. But these protocols are reusable and often even to some extent replaceable. So it's not that tightly bound part of a protocol stack, but actually maybe even a distinct layer. And for the layer part, what we are being drafting as a definition is this reusable part of the application protocol that is used to transfer the application-specific data items using a standard set of methods that fulfill application-specific operations. So here are the definitions we are planning for that here. Is there any instant reactions or comments on these definitions? So do people recognize that you've been using these or seeing these being used? I see some little bit of nodding in the audience. So at least in the context where I have ended up quite often, when you see that there's you're building an application and then you are underneath have a set of choice for protocols. Having a term to describe what is that thing that is traditionally part of the application layer of our stack, but it has kind of a reusable characteristics and even potential for replacing protocols across seem to be very useful. So that's why we think it's a good idea to have that part here. But if you have recommendations on how should we perhaps tweak those terms, or should we rename them something else, those would be very much welcome. Then moving on, in the WC work, what we have had so far is 6 online meetings since the last IETF. We have been discussing a set of topics. We started with the Splot object model. It's a new IoT object model explorative from Robert from Google. We have been discussing the work is happening in the schema org on the IoT extensions. We have had quite a few meetings on this topic of best practices for data model component reusability. It's a topic we also discussed on the Friday meeting, and I have more details coming on that. And also, how in general can we go about adding semantics to existing instances of data? So if you have data that doesn't have machine-readable semantics when you're consuming it, how can you apply after the fact some different ways of getting those semantics in order to do, for example, translation between different models? And a topic very much related to this one is of this parsing and translating binary data, in particular coming from legacy sources. If you can apply semantics to it, it becomes much more simpler to handle the data in the rest of the pipeline. And finally, one example of a topic that was originally discussed in the core working group, but then we realized there's perhaps more wider research aspects, is this exposing more structured media types in hypermedia exchanges. So in core working group, there is this draft on expressing multiple media types within a single media type. And when we were discussing that in core, we realized, okay, this actually may have much wider implications than just for the draft that was discussed in the core. So then that was discussed in the WC working group, like what are the perhaps wider, longer term implications, or do we have new design patterns here that we should perhaps be more explorative on? Then we also had the WC Hackathon. That was the weekend before the IETF. This was the 5th one, and we had actually 12 participants and a few more extras occasionally showing up. And we had also 1 remote participant. And in this WC Hackathon, we had roughly on a high level the same goal of connecting things from different ecosystems. And we are using hypermedia and shared semantics as the tools to achieve that. But this time we had a slightly more different approach. We had a lot of work done around Coral. So some of the things that we did achieve, we have now, there's a new parser for text form of Coral. It's already published as open source as a Ruby gem. There is also now a basic Coral encoder and parser and a Siri module for the Riot operating systems. And you have links there on the slides for more details. We work quite a bit on Coral examples and use cases to get more practical experience on like how would these things look in practice. And also we have been using quite a bit the Web of Things, W3C Web of Things thing description format. And they are related formats, but slightly taking a different angle on the similar approach. And we were looking into ways to be doing translation between the two. Also, there's a Python implementation from Christian Amsus that is able to do Coral. It was now augmented here to support the latest version of Coral and also able to do visualization of Coral. And one example of that you can see on the slide on the lower right corner. We've also been improving some of the resource directory implementations during the hackathon. And also we did update our Live with M2M TD generator so we can generate thing descriptions from Live with M2M to conform the latest thing description format. Some of the things that we learned over the weekend, it seems to be Coral is working, especially with using for resource discovery, but also beyond. And one experience that was that these hackathons are very useful for getting the implementation and testing guidance, in particular on Coral this time, since we had people who were actually defining Coral and multiple implementers over the same table. You get a lot of good feedback on the approaches on both sides. And also, it seems we are now getting better ideas on how all this should be integrated together to actually achieve interoperability. Then quick update on the Friday work meeting. We had a full day meeting with a half a dozen different topics. We started with the data model component reusability discussions. For example, discussed the vocabulary definitions and what kind of term mappings we do need there. Terms we're discussing for affordances, traits, resources, objects, etc. Different models use slightly kind of different terms. How do these fit together and how can we use those to go actually across different models? One conclusion was that we do need tools that we can use to describe these data models. And it also seems to be need for language that is independent from the transport. And this common Metamodel language that Michael will be discussing a bit later is one example of that. And also, there are a lot of choices what you have to do when you design these data models, in particular, how fixed or dynamic features should the data models have. And we did manage to gather a bit of guidance on that, but maybe getting a bit more formal, writing a wishy note on that, or even a research group RFC could be very helpful. And finally, since we've been focusing quite a bit on hypermedia in this work, we discussed how do you actually expose these things at hypermedia on different levels. Speaking of hypermedia, well, one topic was using Coral to bring more hypermedia to IoT. One observation we had is that the Coral today comes without batteries. You need a bit more to actually build your application on it. So we should perhaps start building some of those aspects to make it more easy to use in real use cases. One thing was this common composable vocabulary, in particular link relation types that could be defined, and also tools around Coral. One tool, for example, was this TD and between Coral transformations. We did discover that this whole topic of authorizations, like who is allowed to say what and where and when it comes to link relations, and how you can, for example, use this in RD seems to be a very interesting topic to explore more. And also, Coral complex. Coral is a very simple format, but of course, the more features you add, the more complexity you add there. And one interesting design goal when it comes to link format was that you cannot have it only in ROM. And that's what we call ROMability, and how much of that can you have with Coral in what kind of boundary conditions. Seems to be an interesting area to explore more. We also discussed this common Metamodel language, which is basically an abstraction between having expressive powers to have high fidelity details of different models. And the idea is that when you have this Metamodel, you can have different ecosystems mapping to the same model, and with that you can achieve interoperability, but you can also describe this common model using the Metamodel. And then when you go to concrete implementations from different organizations, for example, you can use protocol bindings and semantic annotations to achieve that. One good observation on this kind of models was that we really need to make this usable for domain experts, because oftentimes when these models would be described by a language, it is someone who may not have years of IETF or data model background, but actually has domain expertise, for example, in agriculture or smart metering. So instead of showing what we call a core dump, perhaps something more human-friendly language is an important design consideration. We had a whole session on security. There is already one draft, new draft on that, enabling network access for IoT devices from the cloud, currently an individual submission, but something we could consider as an RG document. Also, what we were discussing is that it would be very good to document some of those success factors and lessons that we have learned from different security mechanisms in this area. For example, why EAP has been rather successful in its own area. And also, when it comes to the security work outside of the tilting RG, but within IETF, like if we can come up with specific requirements, especially on the constrained IoT, for example, for new crypto, that would be very helpful for the rest of the community. Edge and IoT has been a very popular topic in tilting RG over years already, and this is something that also CoinRG and DinRG are working on various aspects. We've been looking mostly on the IoT specifics on this, but there seems to be a lot of interesting work to be done together with CoinRG and DinRG. But the question here was how we get the thing-centric view to edge computing. We also discussed this, some called beyond edge, and even abyss computing was one term that was raised during the session. And also, what kind of instances today do we have of these in-network resources and computing? And for example, PubSub Broker was raised as one instance of that. And do we have already in the core infrastructure some examples of storing some of your representations in the network and having network infrastructure helping you? We did conclude that yes, also in this area, we're going to need more terminology. And even though we might not be ready today to make the architecture for Edge and IoT, some fragments of that architecture and more terminology around that is likely to be very useful. There is a individual submission within RG already on the IoT integrated with edge computing. We concluded that that's perhaps a good way to continue with our collaboration and extending on that, and perhaps considering later adopting as an RG document. There was also one spin-off topic from this whole Edge and IoT, which was this industrial IoT. So of course, the industrial side has a lot of commonalities with the other areas, but it also has some specific requirements, for example, on the criticality of different operations. So what is that piece that is different in industrial area, and how to explore that was one thing that we highlighted. And finally, something we didn't have in the agenda originally, but what Ted Lemon raised up as an potentially interesting topic is this layer 3 considerations, and what Ted called thing-to-thing, end-to-end. So it seems that there are quite a few challenges still when it comes to routing and reachability when you are connecting constrained node networks, such as thread networks, with each other over a LAN, for example, a home network. So things as of today just don't happen automatically, but you do need some infrastructure management, for example, the home network control protocol. Also, there are challenges when it comes to discovery. We did discuss that we have quite a lot of tools on this in the core setup, for example, resource directory. But then you also run into challenges, how do you actually find your resource directory, in particular in this kind of heterogeneous environment. Also on the security side, for example, isolation control and sworn was one of the mechanisms that were highlighted could be helping here. But overall, the conclusion was that someone should probably implement all this and really see where are the gaps. We do think we have a good set of tools available, but do they actually fit in practice as well together as we think? Probably some good implementation work would be very helpful here. Okay, that was the report from the various thing-to-thing research group. activities so far. Is there any questions or comments on this before we go for Michael's presentation? Okay, seems we don't have Michael yet online. He is currently attending another meeting, so we may have some challenges finding the common slots. So perhaps while waiting for Michael to join, we could take the W3C Web of Things update first. And on all of these topics that we have highlighted here very briefly, if you're interested in working on any of these, please do join. You can ask from us chairs what's the right place, who to contact to actually start the work on these. Okay, Axel, I need to.
Okay, everyone ready? Good. Yeah, so this is another update of this collaboration with the W3C, where we have the Web of Things activity. Main part of the work is happening in the working group at the moment. As a quick reminder, this is the big picture of what we are working on. So what we have is a big umbrella document about the what architecture. And there we basically describe, blue sheets are coming. There we describe how the building blocks that we are standardizing fit together. So the overall idea is that we do not define a complete vertical solution that now everyone has to implement, but we look at standards that complement what is already out there and help the interoperability and the integration of these individual systems already out there. And a key part of this is the so-called thing description. So it's a document format that allows you to learn what a thing provides. So it has general metadata. It has what we now concluded on calling affordances to be aligned with the hypermedia work. And it also includes then the protocol bindings. So you can figure out in a uniform format what protocol is used, what tweaks have been applied to this protocol, and so on. And we have a central interaction model to simplify, to connect this with applications. So we have properties to encapsulate data, to have basically state that is exposed by things. We have actions to trigger physical processes on the things that might run for a certain time. And we have events to support these asynchronous notifications that you might receive by a thing. And we then have, in addition, the scripting API. So this was work on defining a common runtime, a bit similar to the web browser, where you have a common runtime to define web applications, but this now transferred to the IoT, where it's more about automation tasks, orchestration that would run in the background, but still against the standard API for communication and so on. And the last document down here is the binding templates. This is basically a document that helps you to define your thing descriptions. There you can look up how you would describe an existing device, for instance, of the OCF ecosystem, of lightweight M2M ecosystem, and so on. So it is an explainer document to the central thing description. And we are now close to completing this work on the first sets of building blocks. Here, the picture is now as follows. The architecture document and the thing description are recommendation track documents. So in W3C speak, that means those will become standards. And the scripting API, unfortunately, was downgraded to a working group node. That means all the work, all the findings that we have are still covered in a document. We will officially publish this document, but it's not normative. The reason for this was that kind of the interest of implementing this and gaining experience hands-on decreased, unfortunately, over time. And in the end, we had kind of two camps with different opinions. The central problem is here, APIs are difficult. There are so many styles out there. and often it's even a fashion how to do it. So for instance, even in the W3C for the web platform itself, the overall recommendations change over time. So this would be an item that we take to the interest group and then try to have more consensus while gaining more experience actually hands-on implementing this. Good. Let's have a look at the timeline. So overall, the efforts were now going on for almost 5 years. So the first actual work in the W3C started in 2014 with a workshop with quite some high interest. Shortly after that, we started the interest group that then worked on defining basically what should be the first building blocks, and also worked on a charter for the working group, which then started end of 2016. As you can see, the now bar is pretty close to the end of charter, and we are currently in the wrapping up phase. So it's a lot of work that we have to do at the moment. Our last face-to-face meeting was end of January to mainly work on the test suite. So something that you have to provide in W3C is a test report that shows that the recommendation is basically implementable by 2 independent implementations, and those work correctly according to the specification. We have then prepared the supporting documents that are required, like an explainer to send it to the TAG, the Technical Advisory Group of W3C, and we are currently running the wide review. So for everyone who is interested and maybe even adopted this, so for instance, there's a collaboration with OCF, with 1M2M, and so on, have a look at these 2 URIs and provide us with anything that you might have had on the back burner or thought you will come back to us. Now would be the time, because we have to close this soon. Plan is to publish or transition to the so-called candidate recommendation on the 9th of April. So basically in roughly 2 weeks. That means it's a freeze then, and we then have to work on the test suite. So basically provide enough test results that show that this document is complete and sufficient to implement correctly. And then according to the process of W3C, there will be another transition to the so-called proposed recommendation. If we are successful to show that everything is quite right on the 21st of May. And this would be an important date for those people who have or work for companies or organizations that are active in the W3C. Please tell your AC rep that there is a new proposed recommendation, and if you support this work, that he should basically fill out the questionnaire on this new documents. And from there, we hopefully then have the standards ready by end of June. Another announcement just before that is here, the second workshop on the W3C. So what's this about? We had the last workshop about 5 years ago, back then to see what is the general interest of doing this kind of work in the W3C. So more application-centric standardization work on the Internet of Things. And this workshop we want to use to, of course, disseminate our findings, basically what we have learned in this quite diversified group that we had in the W3C, and then also discuss the way forward, meaning, what should the interest group be working on, how big should be the scope of the working group. By then we will already have to have charter proposals ready, and but we will be able to discuss those proposals at this workshop. If you're interested to participate, we have this call for participation. So this is a W3C process that it's open to and free to participate at these workshops. However, you have to submit this notion of interest, which is just an expression of interest. So you basically say, hey, I'm interested in this, can I please come? If you want to have some stage time, so participate in some of the panel discussions, give a keynote or presentation and so on, then you have to submit the 1 to 5 pages position paper. Also, if you have good opinion on what should be done, then this position paper would be the right format for you. The submissions are handled through EasyChair, so those from the academic background should be aware of this. The deadline is unfortunately pretty soon, so the 15th of April. I saw that there are some of the announcement systems still say it's the 7th of April. If you find that, always pick the latest date that you find on some official source. At the moment, it's the 15th of April. Notifications would be then end of April, and then there's another deadline for the actual registration to show up. More you can find under this link here for the call for participation. And that's it. Any questions, any comments? Okay.
Everything's super clear. Thanks, Matthias. Okay, do we have now Michael online? Michael, can you hear us? Okay, seems we're not limited to the beginning to have these technical challenges today. Give up the slides. Okay, seems Michael is having still a bit of challenges. If things don't work out smoothly now, Christian, would you like to take your resource directory replication first, that we can give Michael some time to join?
Hello? Oh. Hello, my name is Christian Amsus, and I'd like to present actually...
Closer.
And I'd like to actually present two documents here. The first being resource directory replication, which I was asked to take here from the constrained RESTful environment, because it is more of a document that looks at whether things can work without really prescribing what needs to be done, or without building so much. And the second is a proposal that I have that takes what the first document shows can be done and builds something that I think will be very useful for a web of connected things that directly work with each other. So the first one I'm referring to is groundwork document here. It just sets out the structure. So it describes some challenges in upscaling, what are the requirements, and what are patterns that can be used to have a resource directory that is not only a single thing that everything depends on, but a composition of several devices that together act as a larger one. One like I'd not say trivial solution, but the first solution that comes to mind is having a single application under a single authority that has some kind of backend that more or less magically orchestrates things, and whenever the request comes in, all instances of that application refer to the shared database. But it turns out that due to the way that the resource directory is built, it is not necessary to have such a tight coupling. So you can have several resource directories that might, for example, be announced that might all individually be found, or that might be announced under a DNS name that resolves to different hosts, or whichever setup you have. And a registration happens at one device, at one entry node. And when lookups happen, those lookups are more or less proxied across all the participating resource directory nodes, whether that is eager caching or whether that is whether data is distributed in another way. There's various possibilities depending on the particular requirements. So there is very little running code to back this, short of a very small examples. But the rough findings of the document are that we can have resource directories that are distributed and tolerant for single nodes to fail, and still provide for lookups, still allow registrations, and still have a way for registered devices to say that, to recognize that their registration partner is just gone and they fail over to something different. Yeah, so that is what the first document sets out. Yeah, let's now talk about something else. That is, how do we describe with which devices another device talks? So let me very briefly sketch out a scenario where we are having a small device that talks to your cell phone, and they are just finding each other in the local network and have an address to express that name, that relation, what the phone is looking at. But as soon as the phone leaves the network, for example, fades over to cellular network, that name won't work anymore. So let's build a wish list. What do we want of names? So stable identifiers is something that's probably good because cool URIs don't change, and the URIs are what we are using in web linking. They should probably also be URLs, so be usable to resolve that name into something that we can work with. And they should be able to set us up for end-to-end security. So if I have an IP address, no matter how stable that is, that won't tell me how I know how to trust whoever does that. And while we are at building a shopping list, I'd like that solution to work with constrained devices that don't even need to grow their code size in order to do that. Turns out we can do that. So RD-Link is a proposal that I have about an additional way of how we could address devices that in parts builds on resource directories conceptually, but is largely distributed and decentralized system. So how could those URIs look like? Well, if you're probably familiar with the regular scheme, so co-op plus AT is something that Core is working on to have a single scheme rather than one scheme for UDP and one scheme for TCP. And then we need to have something that is certainly a property of that device, and in my opinion, best thing for those things, especially if we can't rely on being part of any centralized structure or hierarchical structure for that matter, is a cryptographic identifier. And that should be still usable in for expressing a particular resource on that thing. So it works like a regular, like any other regular co-op URI, and has a path component, and you can do operations on that. Now, how do we find such addresses? Because I mean, rdlink.rpar is not exactly something where I would expect a quad A record to quad A request to resolve. Those could either, in local scenarios when maybe we don't even have an uplink, be resolved using multicast, and in most for the internet case, those could be entered into a distributed hash table with some additional assertions that the address that we are advertising is actually an address that is backed by whatever cryptographic identifier is in that address. Now, of course, we're talking about constrained devices here, so those will in all likelihood not participate in that DHD, but we can have helper nodes, and those helper nodes would form something like a global resource directory that might not support everything that resource directory is set out to, especially kind of in-depth resource lookups will not work because you can't just find everything on the internet. But it will look very similar to resource directory and participate in all the protocol negotiation steps that a resource directory can participate in as well. So this, of course, it doesn't kind of come from nothing. So I've looked at several other earlier approaches to the same issue of finding names for things that can be used. So the Tor project and their onion addresses are certainly a large influence. I've looked at various others as well. I do not claim to have read through all of that. In particular, the probably 30-ish RFCs on HIP. But those are all things from which I'd like to learn and take lessons, and much of that has already gone into the design I'm presenting here. So from the idea, how do we get up forward? One thing is this relies on working core. So there are two kind of building blocks that still need to be fleshed out. Next step for me would be to do some prototyping and to get actually running code. And then to answer questions of operations. So right now I'm having a .rpar address in there. I think I haven't even entered something into an IANA registry yet. And having a .rpar domain is definitely, using a .rpar domain is definitely a step up from that. So one question is, for me, that I will need to answer in the course of this is, how will that work in particular? But also something that where I hope to get feedback from the research group is, who else would participate in that? So how could that be spread out? Because this will, if it is to succeed, this will need to be an effort that is distributed among several parties. And the goal I'm having with that is that I would like to run this with off-the-shelf devices by 2023. Now, I am aware that this is ambitious, but I think that if the people that might use this work together, this is something that can be achieved. Which brings me to the last step on that. That is my questions to the research group. Or so I would love to gather general feedback and ideas. What this mistakes I made, things I did not consider, also things that someone else might have solved. An interesting question, especially with respect to also to the chairs, and is this at all the right place? So I'm standing here because basically resource directory replication moved here, and I think this is a good place because this is definitely something experimental. But I might be wrong. But the most important purpose of this presentation is to gather you in. So do you have requirements for similar applications? Do you want to use that? Do you want to participate in that? And I hope that there are a few yeses, and I'd like to hear about that. Oops. Did I just go off the slides or?
You fell off the edge. You're now in the abyss.
Hello, Bill here from Tampere University. I can start with the first part of the presentation, which is about the resource directory replication. And I think this is work that should have been started a long time ago, because this is actually a really pertinent problem. We need that replication in many places and in many use cases. And I've seen this being applied in various industries that without replication, we find extremely weird implementations where suddenly a resource directory becomes a co-app server, and then they put a client inside it and then try to do registrations to a different resource directory and so on. So I think that's really good, and I hope that work goes forward. And then the something completely different part. That is interesting. I'm obviously very keen on the protocol negotiation as well as the Approa plus AT. So I'd like to discuss this more offline with you. Unfortunately, I was not able to look through this draft before today, but I think I like the ideas what you have proposed, and especially the prior art is it's there. I think there are some things that we can also look outside this prior art. For example, OCF has a similar scheme that we could resolve.
Yeah.
So we could talk about that a bit later.
Yeah, thank you.
So Eric, not Mark. So I didn't catch. So in the case of the global, resource directory, be it a DHT or anything else. So what are the thoughts about sort of having some level of control about who can see what information? Sure, these are basically hashes, but still, I might only want to expose it to my company or my family or whatever.
Yeah. So there are three answers that I have to this. First is that when it comes to things that the device tells about itself, which usually in a resource directory registration are all my different resources, those would probably be elided by most devices, which is okay with the resource directory. Now the second is, what do I know of this hash? What can I know of this hash? And I've talked to people from the Tor project, and with their version 3 identifiers, they have a very interesting concept which basically encrypts the entries to the distributed hash table with the names themselves. So only someone who has been given that name is at all be able to look anything up about that. And the third part that I see.
So that name is a character string name.
Yeah. So that name is looks like a Tor address. So that is 60-ish characters of base 32 encoded parts that are from a authority component under a well-known domain. And the third part is about restricting control with respect to organizations. Now, first, this does not by itself expose the devices from the network. So if your device is unreachable from the outside, unless the device asks someone outside to proxy for it, it will still not be reachable. It can opt to proxy, but it will usually not. And the other thing is that those helper nodes, you cannot only you do not need to rely on any existing network there. So you can just as well have at the border of your company, run one of those nodes yourself at the well-known address. Like implement that anycast address yourself, participate in all the steps. But if you say that your nodes should not be announced to the outside, but should be announced within your organization, or you want to be able to reach outside nodes, you can do that at that point.
So I think you convinced me that the most you can do is sort of count how many people are sitting behind some IP address prefix. I can count them. If I had access to the whole DHC, I can count saying this is a big organization because they have 1 million of these things as opposed to 3.
Yes, you can make guesses on that. Although I've looked into even hiding your position there when you're running one of those more advanced helper node. So you could do even more, but that's like probably one of the next.
Yeah, if you have a key there, you could actually decide that I'm going to encrypt the information that's in the DHC node as well. So
yeah. What I was trying to say is that you could even have your helper hide everything that is running on your network behind a Tor hidden service if you're so inclined.
Okay, thank you, Christian. And regarding your question to the chairs, yeah, this definitely sounds very explorative. So, and if there is interest in the group, then I think this is certainly the right place to look into this. So, and based on what I see so far, there's look at this initial interest, so seems worth exploring deeper.
Thank you.
Maybe I could add the hallway discussion that comes up again and again is that we are putting these IoT devices into jails now, and we need to find ways to plumb between these jails. And the directory infrastructure might actually help us do that. But of course, it would have to operate the doors of those jails, and so there are some interesting questions of what exactly a directory can do in this space. But it goes beyond just having an IP address of something. You need to operate more machinery to actually be able to start to talk to the node.
I'm not sure I followed all of that, but I hope we can follow up on that.
Thank you. So we seem to have Michael on the mute icon now. Michael, can you hear us?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I wasn't the tooltips on this thing have changed, and now it's hard to tell what does what. How do I go into presentation mode? Can you give me a hint? Is there a button?
I'm showing you slides. How about that?
Oh, okay. So if you show my slides, then I don't need to present. Okay, that's fine. Okay, so I'll just start. So yeah, this is going to be about the status and things that are happening around IoT extensions for schema.org. We used to call this IoT schema.org, but we probably aren't going to have a subdomain. As you see from the presentation, we're likely to integrate directly. So next slide, please.
Yes.
Okay, so briefly, we formed a community group, but it's still not active. The plan is to do most of this work in a W3C community group for the extensions. But we haven't actually spun that up yet. It's formed and people have joined and more people can join, but we're not really using it yet. The next step, as you'll see, is to engage that. And I want to talk about how we're going to integrate IoT extensions into schema.org, and then a thing that's recently come up. This is called One Data Model. It's an industry initiative that is very closely aligned. So next slide, please. Yeah, so would you move forward to a few slides to the schema.org integration proposal part? I'd like to go through that first. Yeah, that one. Okay, so what we're planning on doing is contribute to schema.org based on the prototype definitions that we have, which are capabilities and interaction affordances and events, actions, and properties and data items. And we'll probably need to rename those to prevent name conflicts and to come up with names for those that everyone likes, but a few simple relation types, like a capability provides an interaction pattern and provides output data, and that can be used, of course, standalone. Other things could provide output data. Data item constraints are already there in property value constraints, and we want to add some property types for features of interest. So we can say, for example, that this temperature sensor is measuring the oil temperature of an automobile, and the oil is the feature of interest, and doing that linkage allows the semantic client to be able to understand what they're doing. So the definitions themselves, when we say here's a thermostat, here's a light bulb, here's a capability to turn something on and off, here's a capability to set the level of something, those might not be in the IoT, they won't be in the schema.org core definition model. They'll likely be in external namespaces. So the idea is to just integrate the basic core property types and object types, and then let the people who want to define things use their own namespace. And this is a pattern that we're also seeing in this one data model. Okay, next slide, please. So what this is basically just a description of what we're doing. This is basically the core model right here. This is really the part we want to add to schema.org. And the next slide. And along with the extensions for feature of interest. So this is basically basically the model that we've been developing over the last couple of years of collaboration in schema.org and IoT schema in the extension group. And this is really what we've come up with. So it has the core schema, properties, actions, events, interaction patterns, and then feature of interest linkage. So this allows us to pretty much say, go tell me the temperature of the heat exchanger tube side outlet, for example. And all those features of interest that are in, say, brick schema can be combined with the definitions of sensing and actuation that we have here and have a whole semantic identifier. Somebody's going to the mic? No, somebody's walking out of the room. Okay. Then next slide, please. I think we're, yeah, okay. So the plan is to basically create GitHub issues and drive discussion in our collab organization and the community group. And at some point when we know exactly what we want to contribute, we will go and create issues on the schema.org and engage them and start the debate and discussion about, how to add this stuff to schema.org. All right, so now I think it's a good time to go back, and now that I've reminded everyone what the core model looks like, let's go back and look at one data model stuff. Okay, so the proposal is to basically, so one data model is a bunch of SDOs and vendors. So it's Zigbee, OCF, GSMA, OMA with lightweight M2M, and Google and SmartThings and Amazon and Comcast. And basically, it's to create a high-level semantic model that does not require a particular protocol implementation. So it's essentially the same mission that we took on in the schema.org extensions. And what it turns out is that we're probably going to converge on the same patterns. And the alignment is uncanny in terms of how well, it's I guess the work we've done is held up pretty well, because it seems like that this is the same conclusions are being made in this group. I'm currently at the first face-to-face meeting of this group, and already made proposals of the nature that are, well, the proposals are in the link here in my GitHub. Basically, it's a high-level semantic model with protocol bindings, and it says that, for example, you can turn a light on or off, or measure a temperature, or set a set point, and do that based on the abstract high-level model in the application, and then the system will be able to sort of select the protocol bindings and figure out, from the protocol binding that you need to go do a post at this particular address, and what the format should be, and what the data types are, and this sort of thing. So let's look at a couple of examples. I've got some that I pulled out here. Next slide, please. So the UML model, okay, this is just repeating what we've already said. There's a thing, and it has capabilities, and they have interaction affordances, which can be events, actions, and properties, and then there's some data types. And the data typing is for the range and the range units, things like that, what's in the enum, et cetera. Okay, next slide, please. So I'm just going to blow through these and not go line by line, but here's describing a switch and a switch level capability, which is an on-off and a dimming capability. And basically it says for a switch, I have a value property and an on and off actions. And for the level property, I have a level property and a set level action. Really simple. Next slide, please. Yeah. So then those things linked, just here are some of the things they link to. So remember, I guess I explain a little bit. This is essentially JSON LD, which is JSON with some RDF hooks that allow you to do namespaces and URIs and things like that. So when we say add ID, that means that this thing is meant to be linkable from externally. This is a URI. It's defining where this thing is in the data space by URI. So the switch level property, that's a thing that I can refer to from another file, right? And it says that a level property is a subclass of affordance, and it has switch level data. It has a data item. And it's saying the set level action is also an interaction affordance. It's an action type, and it has level data and rate data. So basically, with this information, the application knows what kind of data items and are available. And then next slide, please. And the data items themselves are defined in yet another place. Again, each one has an ID, so it's linkable. And it says that the switch value data in this case consists of a string enumeration with the terms on and off in lowercase in English language, for example. It could be a Boolean, it could be 1 and 0, it could be a lot of different things. And so the idea is to be able to represent exactly what this existing device does, which is well, it's not really a device, it's a SmartThings pseudo device that you have access to in the cloud. But it's just basically what you might call a shadow or a mirror. So the data items that we're using here are value data, that's the on-off, the level data, which is an integer from 0 to 100, and rate data, which is an integer from 0 to 65,535. So now the application knows, what it can do. It knows sort of what the data items are needed, and it knows how to form those data items. And this is all the definition that we're doing at this level. The next level, we're taking these terms like switch value data and level data and putting them to a protocol binding. So next page, please. Yeah, so here's an example of a protocol binding. This is a fragment of a Swagger file, an OAS 2.0. And it says this resource has a path. This is the path of the resource, and it has get and post operations. And what we've done is added annotations to say at type, which means that the semantic type sort of tags these things. So what you know is that this URI exposes a value property, and it's also where you go to do an on action and an off action. And then when you look at the verbs, the get says this is how you access the value property. This is how you interact with it on a read. And post is sort of this is how you interact with it on a write. And post is also used to invoke the actions. So the idea is this protocol binding. The client already knows how to look through the Swagger and figure out how to create a request, but it doesn't really know what they do. And so this basically adds information about what these requests do and how to do the different things. Next slide, please. And the last thing is it says the data. So when I want to send the value, and this is basically in the Swagger part that says describes the values, it says it's a Boolean, which actually doesn't really match up with the other example, but let's just pretend that the other example said Boolean, because this is OCF now. So it says that there are some types here. That's the value data, an on value data, and off value data. And so what this means is that if I look at the on and say I want to switch this on, it means that I have to put a Boolean true in, and if I switch it off, I have to put a Boolean false in. And this is all the annotation for what data values you need. And then the value data just gives schema constraints like 0 to 256 or whatever. Right? So this is basically what we're proposing as the way what the one data model looks like, as the representation for this high-level abstract model that all of these different SDOs and vendors can map their existing models to. And this is really meant to facilitate eventual convergence around a single model that everyone uses. Right. I think that's about all. Let's see, what's the next slide look like? Are we going into the? Yeah. Okay. So we already talked about that. Going on ahead toward the end, and I think there. Okay. So again, schema.org. What we're planning on doing is working on the existing ontology until we get it ready to put into schema.org, and we need some broad agreement across a lot of different communities on what these are. And then we need to figure out how to make the definitions how to make the navigation work on the definitions. So we have a web page you can go to read them. Next slide. Yeah, so on the definitions, we're basically going to start creating these examples. Now that we have a format and tools and all that, we're going to go forward and you know, have as many of these examples as we can. And then in terms of tools, most of what we get requests for to make this easy for developers to use. So the same thing is happening in one data model. So basically we're looking at a best practices guideline and eventually some tools and scripts that allow the developer to automate a lot of the redundant parts. Right, so we're looking at probably adding a few new classes like data typing and some common thing types and also enumeration. So we may be adding a little bit more to the ontology, but these are things that general problems in the industry that need to be solved, like what the enumerations for the fan mode of a thermostat and things like that, for example. We want to make those interoperable as well. Right? Next slide, please. So yeah, building the web interface, we probably need to use shapes constraints and do some navigation, and then we need to figure out, if you go to schema.org, how do you get over to this other namespace and navigate these definitions? Is it one entry point or separate or whatever? We need to figure all that out. I think that's about it. There's probably one more slide.
Yes.
Yeah, feature of interest. So this is a thing where what's happened in the last couple of years is some folks that in the automotive domain using Geneva VSS and the building domain using Haystack have kind of decided to align with this sort of way of doing definitions and build feature of interest ontologies that are going to be compatible with schema.org and what we're doing. So they're calling it VSS schema and brick schema for automotive and buildings. And what we want to do is work with those folks that are defining those in Volkswagen and BMW and other folks who are doing the building stuff, and you know, come up with some really good feature of interest properties for linking features of interest into the definitions or vice versa. Also, at the W3C meeting last in Lyon, we came up with a number of other collaboration points with sensor data and geospatial data on the web, and then we want to also explore collaboration through IIC with for some industrial definitions. So that's, I think that's all. Is there one more slide? No, that's it. Okay. So that's where we are. The big news is this one data model thing, which really is in its early stages, but I'd say that the outlook is very good, that a lot of these SDOs and manufacturers can make some agreements at this high level. So that's kind of the takeaway.
Thank you, Michael. Is there anything you want to report about what's going on where you are right now?
Okay, so I'm in Philadelphia at the first face-to-face meeting of the one data model. I wouldn't even call it an organization. It's I don't even know. I guess you'd call it an organization, but we have a group of folks, and we're getting together to sort of hash out some of the high-level details. It's an oxymoron. You know, how we're going to go about this. And it really started off as a fairly low-level thing that, okay, there's a Zigbee model, there's an OCF model, there's a lightweight M2M model. How do we just pick the best one? You know, what do we do? And through the discussions that led up to this, we've kind of come around to realizing that we need to do something like capabilities, events, actions, and properties. And everyone now agrees that we really want it decoupled. So what we're doing this week is basically working through some of the actual examples and, you know, nailing down some of the decisions. We had a really good day yesterday of pretty much agreeing on what the core model is going to look like and where the bounds are. And now we're down to, okay, what if we need to, how do we compose things? What are the limits of what we can compose? We're down to talking about what the license is like for different SDOs that contribute things that already have licenses. So I think we're down into the the architecture discussion, and this afternoon we're going to try to build some representative samples. So, and I've made some proposals about, you know, like this earlier thing that earlier slides we saw of how we could use JSON LD with namespaces and all of that as a common definition format. And no one else has proposed any alternates. So it looks like we may be able to go forward with without a lot of arguing about what the format should look like. We'll see. Anyway, this afternoon is the concluding quarter of the meeting. We've met all day yesterday and we're meeting today, and this afternoon we're going to work through some examples. There, question from the mic.
Hi, it's Eve.
Yeah.
I am curious to know who's not at the meeting that you're going to need to reach out to and draw into the discussion.
We'd really like to see Apple at the table.
Yeah, in addition to maybe companies, are there other organizations in the IoT space that, or general, an interesting segment, whether it's automotive or whatever, that you need to bring in to, endorse as well?
That's a really good question, and I think what we're looking at is we probably want to enable domain experts to create these definitions and not just pull things from existing SDOs. So we want to get people who are more, well, domain experts, like we mentioned with IIC, for example. We'd also like to get people that don't have liaison agreements. Currently, it's sort of working under a liaison agreement with OCF and Zigbee and all of that, and we have some invited experts, but we really want to bring in people from IETF and IRTF as well and get more interaction there. I mean, we have some people who are in both, like Ari and myself and some others, but we really want to try to open it up a little bit. So I'd say in those two areas, get the other representation from other SDOs and other people that are building definitions, including Apple, and also the domain experts. Do you have suggestions on other engagements we might want to do?
No, not yet, but it would be great to see the full list of participants at some point. But it's an exciting initiative, so yeah, we'll look forward to your minutes, your notes, or whoever's notes.
I'm taking notes, but we have other people taking minutes as well, so hopefully there'll be a good report.
Awesome, thanks.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Michael. So I'm not seeing anybody else queuing up for the microphone. So I hope you have a successful meeting over there, and looking forward to discussing it in more detail.
Great, thanks. And one more thing, if anyone wants to participate, we have a way of inviting experts. We have an invited expert kind of category that they obviously won't be able to participate in some of the, if we go into any NDA space, but I'm hoping we never have to do that. We try to keep it all open. So please let me know if you'd like to participate, and I'll try to get an invitation for you.
Okay, can I queue up for that?
You're on the list already. You should be getting an invitation soon.
Okay, so, thank you. So, thank you, Michael. We are done with this item, and the only item that's left on the agenda, the only large item, is Klaus telling us about using Coral to bring more hypermedia to IoT. Now, one problem maybe in preparing this segment is that one or two of the Think Research Group summary meetings ago, I gave a quick tutorial about what Coral is, and maybe we should put a link to that tutorial because it's recorded on YouTube.
Which is a property ID, a property, the data type, but you'll see we also include.
Hello, Michael, can you turn down your microphone, please? Hello? I think it's gone. Thank you. So maybe we should provide a link to that tutorial, which is recorded on YouTube, if you want to have a little bit more detail on how Coral works. And this segment here really is about looking at the larger world of how you can build applications in a RESTful hypermedia-oriented way, and talk about the place that Coral has in this world. So let's hand over to Klaus.
Okay, thank you. So Ari already talked a bit earlier in this meeting about what we did at the hackathon. And I have a few slides just to provide a bit more background on what we did. There. And then I guess it would be a good opportunity to take some time for discussion and next steps and how we might want to move forward with this. And I don't have slides for that. But before I come to the hackathon things, I want to briefly talk about hypermedia, the IETF and IRTF in general. So this idea of using hypermedia for interactions where there's not a human in front of a screen clicking on links and looking at funny pictures, but using it to drive the interactions between machines has been around for a while. And in several occasions, people have come up with some kind of hypermedia format, usually based on JSON, that they propose for driving these machine-to-machine interactions in some way. And a surprising number of those have been published as internet drafts. None of them, of these often called hypertext application languages, have made it to a working group document status so far. But as the number keeps increasing over time, it shows there is some potential here. And there's also some need for standardization, because essentially all of these formats are almost doing the same thing, but slightly different. So a bit older is the hypertext application language, HAL. More recent is JSON Hyperschema, which has the interesting approach of not putting the hypermedia on the wire, but instead augmenting existing JSON documents with hypermedia controls that then tell you how you can interact with the service based on this data. Very recent is the profiled hypertext application language, which is unrelated to HAL. And my proposal is Coral. And for a while, there has been this HTTP link header field, which also falls into the category of providing machine-readable and machine-understandable hyperlinks for navigating and interacting with HTTP-based applications. And in the core working group, we have the link format that is now showing a bit of its age. So we are thinking of maybe replacing that with Coral at some point. And right now, the primary use case for link format is this well-known core resource, where you can ask a server, please tell me what resources do you have? And Mark Nottingham has a related draft for HTTP, which he calls a home document, where you can ask the server, please give me a home document, which is like the entry point to your server. So Coral is yet another hypermedia format intended for these machine-to-machine interactions. And it does define a data model, which consists of links, which allow you to navigate between resources, and forms taken from the concept of HTML forms, which allow you to make submissions, essentially, to the server. And that's enriched with the metadata about the resources that I mentioned, so that a machine can decide which links are relevant to me based on some kind of vocabulary that I know, and how can I make some requests. And Coral comes with two serialization formats. The primary one is based on CBOR, and it's a very compact binary format. It's suitable for constrained environments. And that's the biggest difference to the other hypermedia formats I showed on the previous slides, because those are mainly targeted at the big web and not at constrained environments where every byte counts. It turns out that this binary format is so compact that you almost only can look at it as a hex dump, or that's not very useful for humans. So there's also a text-based format for Coral that we mostly use for writing down examples. And then that would get compressed into the binary format. And if I had to summarize Coral in 3 sentences, I would describe it as it gives you a description of what is the resource that you're currently looking at, what can you do with that resource, and how does the resource relate to other resources. And how that looks like in this text format is shown on the next couple of slides. So one example that has been used for a while is Carsten's coffee machine. It's still not very well-defined example, but the intention is to create some showcase for different data models or interaction models and try to see how that works out. And one concrete instance of that was presented as part of this Splot data model in Wishy. And I took that example and tried to convert it to Coral. And what you now can see here is, I won't go into the details, but roughly it provides a bunch of metadata about a resource, a co-op resource that describes the coffee machine itself. And it describes a bit about the current state of the coffee machine. It's currently brewing something. It's making progress. And it has some limits of how many orders can be queued up. And then there's essentially a queue of coffee orders that the machine will produce one after the other. And embedded in there is a form, a create form that instructs a client how to create co-op requests for adding new orders to the end of the queue. And then there are some forms for canceling some coffee order or pausing and unpausing it. Then we had one example where we had a W3C thing description. And I called it Michael's light switch because it's very similar to what we just saw on Michael's slides with the IoT schema org update. And here it's not using a made-up example of coffee machine vocabulary, but the existing IoT schema org vocabulary, at least as much as possible. And this is a good example for showing this. What is it? What operations can it do? How does it relate to other resources? We can see here that this light switch is a light, a binary switch, and a level in IoT schema terms. What can you do with it? You can switch it on and switch it off. So it has a switch state, which you can change. And it also has a level that you can change. The thing description that I used to write this is shown on the left-hand side in a tiny, tiny font. And that's because the thing description is very long, which makes a lot of sense because the thing description does more than Coral. It has this grouping into properties, actions, and events, which Coral doesn't have. And then it has a protocol agnostic part for each possible interaction for, and then the protocol binding that tells you how it's mapped to the specific protocol. So that turns out to be a bit longer. But if you just make the assumption, for example, that you are using co-op, and then it collapses very nicely and very little information and can be expressed nicely in Coral. Then I have this slide. You're not supposed to read this, but I went to the OMA/IPSO definition of reusable resources. So they have these definitions of resources that can be used inside of IPSO objects. And I tried to extract this list of resources, and I gave each one a name that can be used in Corel. So this could be a first step for expressing IPSO structures using Corel. So you could ask an IPSO implementing device, what resources do you have? And it could answer using Corel. Of course, one of the use cases is also this well-known core resource, where we currently use a link format in core to describe the resources of a constrained device. And there's one nice example in RFC 6690, which describes a bunch of resources, a sensors resource, a temperature resource, and a light resource. And it uses these features like resource type that we have defined in core and interface type. And it also uses some of the IANA registered link relation types that you can find in some RFCs. So this we also can do with Corel. And as I already said, the conclusion so far, at least at the hackathon, was it works. So I guess a useful next step would be to do a bit of more experimentation to find out where else we can apply it. Earlier today, we discussed about this use case of group discovery using resource directories, where they used the link format window. And they stumbled, for example, on the problem of extending link format with the new link target attributes. And that's one of the parts where link format is showing its age, and which could be very elegantly solved using Corel, because Corel has these extensibility mechanism built in from the start. So a bit of more experimentation would be useful, and that's where you come in. If you have ideas or use cases where you would be interested to find out if Corel could solve some problems there, it would be very nice to hear of that. But so that's somewhat independent of that. We also now have a bunch of specifications, one for Corel itself and some details, and a couple for essentially showcases of Corel. And these, at least the Corel document itself, is quickly stabilizing, and I guess it would make sense to now look for a home in some working group for it. And the question is, how do we do that?
So you said you were collecting links to other things using Corel, tools using Corel. Is that on that screen right now, or is that in a different place?
I don't have a slide for that, but if you go to this GitHub repository, which is the last link on the slide, you can find some of the implementations that were created during the hackathon, for example. And the GitHub repository also contains a bunch of examples and the ABNF grammar and CDDL and so on.
It looks a bit like this. Okay, and there we would find things like implementations and other material we could use. And I should probably point to the side meeting that we're going to have tomorrow from 3 to 5 in room Tyrolka. Any questions right now? Any comments on your favorite hypermedia format?
It works.
So yeah, for the record, there's some thumbs up from the audience, from Christian. So yeah, maybe for everyone, my personal experience was Coral was like when I first saw it, it took a while to get my head around it, but then more and more I started to actually understand it, the more useful and cool it actually started to look like. So I had a lot of fun over the weekend in the hackathon thinking about how we could be using and especially adding these semantics to Coral and how can we be modeling systems in a slightly different way that we've been doing so far, using more hypermedia also in the IoT space. So I can highly recommend having a closer look at that. And there's I guess we'll post the tutorial also somewhere more easy to access if you think you would need something like that to get started. And I think the Wednesday site meeting is going to be a very good opportunity too, also to learn more about Coral and think about different ways we could be using that. But definitely one of those interesting topics that seems to have a lot of potential to do things in a different way, and it's going to be interesting to explore how far can we take it.
So with that, I think we can give you meeting planning. You want to do meeting planning?
Do we? So yeah, I don't want to keep you away from your dinner plans. But for the meeting planning, so we showed in the beginning what's our tentative plan for now. So you can see the list here. We will of course having this usual with IETF summary meetings, but these meetings usually are not the one where we're doing most of the work. It's mostly where we're reporting what we're doing elsewhere. So highly recommend you to join, for example, the Wishy calls if you're interested in the hypermedia and semantics topics, or if you're interested in these various collaborations. We have other organizations. We have those meetings coming, and we will be posting all of this information on the mailing list. And then in particular, the last point that, as I mentioned, we're very interested on having a co-located event with academia this year, next year, but anyway, doing a bit more of that than what we have done before. So if you have ideas on good venues, good locations, good ways to do that, please talk to us chairs. Okay, so with that, if there's no further questions or comments, thank you everyone for joining, and hope to see many of you tomorrow in the site meeting, and of course rest of the week in the various IoT meetings. Thank you.
So many things break. So many.
Yeah.
And if you haven't signed the blue sheets yet, there's at least one blue sheet here in the front of the room.
Yeah. So I think actually I talked with Sebastian, one of the co-founders, earlier today about exactly this. There was a document that we saw that was exactly it was the 2D space ontology mapping. I don't know.